Picture this. You're sitting in a church on a peaceful Sunday morning in Wichita, Kansas. The congregation is settling in for service when the church council president steps up to the pulpit. He's a respected pillar of the community, a family man, a Boy Scout leader, someone who's dedicated decades of his life to serving God and his neighbours. What you don't know, what nobody knows, is that this same man has spent the last 31 years systematically torturing and murdering innocent families, that the gentle hands now turning the pages of scripture have bound victims with rope. That voice, about to lead you into prayer, has whispered taunts to terrified children hiding in closets. This is the absolutely chilling story of Dennis Rader, better known as BTK, which stood for Bind, Torture, Kill. And what makes this case so utterly disturbing isn't just the horrific nature of his crimes, but how he managed to hide in plain sight for over 3 decades while leading what appeared to be the most ordinary, respectable life imaginable. Welcome back to Boyzilla, where Britain's darkest mysteries meet their match. Now, before we dive into today's absolutely mental story, if you fancy hearing about the strange, the dark and the mysterious, all delivered with a proper British twist, then you've come to the right place. I post new stories daily for you to binge. And if you could do me a solid and give that like button a proper British greeting, maybe offer it a cup of tea, that would be absolutely marvellous. Also, smash that subscribe button and ring that notification bell so you don't miss any of my daily tales. Right, let's get into today's story. If you lived in Wichita between 1974 and 2005, you might have known Dennis Rader as simply the compliance officer, that slightly officious bloke from the council who would knock on your door about overgrown grass or unleashed dogs. You might have seen him at the Christ Lutheran Church every Sunday, where he served faithfully as the congregation president for years. Perhaps your children were in the Cub Scouts with his kids, where Rader volunteered as a leader, teaching young boys about honour and citizenship. Maybe he brought Girl Scout cookies from his daughter, delivered by a seamlessly devoted father who never missed a school event or family gathering. To everyone who knew him, Dennis Rader was the epitome of middle American respectability. Married to the same woman for 34 years, father of 2 well-adjusted children, steady job with the local council, active in his church and community. He was the kind of neighbour you'd trust with your spare keys, the sort of man you'd ask to keep an eye on your house while you were away. But this carefully constructed facade was hiding one of America's most calculated and sadistic serial killers. The BTK Killer announced himself to Wichita in the most horrifying way possible. On January the 15th, 1974, someone broke into the Otero family home and murdered 4 people, Joseph and Julia Otero, and 2 of their children, 11-year-old Josephine and 9-year-old Joseph Jr. But this wasn't a burglary gone wrong or a crime of passion. This was something far more sinister. The killer had taken his time. He'd bound each family member, tortured them, and then killed them one by one, forcing the others to watch. Young Josephine had been hanged in the basement, her body positioned in a way that suggested the killer had derived sexual pleasures from her death. When police arrived at the scene, they were confronted with something none of them had ever encountered before. This wasn't just murder, it was psychological warfare designed to terrorize an entire city. And it was just the beginning. 3 months later, BTK struck again. Catherine Bright was shot and stabbed in her own home while her brother Kevin fought desperately to save her, managing to survive despite being shot in the head. Then came Shirley Vian in 1977, a mother of 3, who was murdered in front of her young children. Nancy Fox followed in December that same year. Each crime scene bore the same horrifying signature: evidence of binding, torture, and a killer who took sovereigns from his victims. But perhaps the most chilling of all was the realization that this wasn't just random violence. Someone was methodically hunting the people of Wichita, selecting victims with careful precision. In October 1974, a local journalist received a phone call that would haunt them forever. The caller's voice was calm, almost conversational, as he directed them to the specific location where they would find a letter hidden in a book. The letter was BTK's first direct communication with the outside world, and it was absolutely chilling in the matter of its tone. The killer took credit for the Otero murders, providing details that only the perpetrator could know. But more than that, he seemed to be enjoying himself. He described his crimes with a detached fascination, as if discussing the weather rather than the brutal murder of an entire family. The letter read, "I write this letter to you for the sake of the taxpayer as well as your time." The letter began, "Those 3 dudes you have in custody are just talking to get publicity for the Otero murders. They know nothing at all." The killer was playing games with the police, treating the investigation like his personal entertainment. He coined his own nickname, BTK, and seemed proud of the terror he was causing. "The code words for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them, BTK." But here's what makes this case so psychologically disturbing. While BTK was writing these taunting letters, Dennis Rader was going home to his wife Paula and their young children. He was attending church services, coaching Little League, and maintaining the perfect facade of suburban normalcy. How does someone compartmentalize their life so completely? How do you kiss your children goodnight with the same hands you just used to strangle someone else's child? As the years passed and BTK's killing spree continued sporadically, Dennis Rader's public persona only grew more respectable. In 1979, he graduated from Wichita State University with a degree in Administration of Justice, studying the very law enforcement techniques that were being used to hunt him. Think about that for a moment. While police were desperately trying to profile BTK, trying to understand how his mind worked, Dennis Rader was sitting in criminology lectures, learning about serial killers' psychology, probably smirking to himself as professors described behavioural patterns that fit him perfectly. He took a job with ADT Security Services, a company that installed alarm systems in people's homes. The irony is almost too twisted to believe. Residents of Wichita were installing security systems to protect themselves from BTK, and BTK himself was the one coming to their homes to set them up. The job was perfect for him. It gave him legitimate access to houses throughout the city, allowed him to study potential victims' routines, and taught him exactly how to disable the very security systems designed to stop him. He could case homes during the day under the guise of professional duties, then return later to commit his crimes. But it gets even more disturbing. Rader often worked late into the evenings, and his wife Paula never questioned where he was. Why would she? He was just a dedicated employee, working hard to provide for his family. On nights when BTK was out hunting for victims, Dennis Rader had the perfect cover story. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Dennis Rader's double life was his deep involvement with Christ Lutheran Church. This wasn't just a Sunday attendance. Rader threw himself into church life with the same methodical dedication he applied to his murders. He served on various committees, helped organize church events, and eventually became the congregation president. Fellow parishioners described him as devout, reliable, and deeply committed to his faith. He read scripture aloud during services, helped with communals, and was trusted with the spiritual well-being of the entire congregation. The psychological disconnect is almost incomprehensible. How do you stand in a church pulpit reading about love, compassion, and forgiveness while secretly fantasizing about your next victim? How do you counsel troubled parishioners about their moral struggles while hiding your own monstrous double life? Rader later admitted that his church activities weren't motivated by general faith, but by the power and control that gave him over other people. He enjoyed being looked up to, being seen as a moral authority. The respect and trust of his fellow churchgoers fed him the narcissistic need for admiration while providing him perfect camouflage for his true nature. But perhaps the most sickening of all, Rader used his position at church to scout potential victims. He paid attention to which families seemed vulnerable, which women lived alone, which houses might be easy to break into. The very people who trusted him with their spiritual welfare were unknowingly being evaluated as potential prey. While BTK was terrorizing Wichita, Dennis Rader was also building a seemingly perfect family life. He married Paula Dietz in 1971, 3 years before his first known murders, and they went on to have 2 children, Kerry in 1978 and Brian in 1975. By all outward appearances, Rader was a devoted father and husband. He attended school plays, coached his son's baseball team, and helped his daughter with her homework. Family photos from this period show a man who looks generally happy and relaxed, the perfect of suburban contentment. But beneath this facade, Rader was living a horrifying double life that his family knew nothing about. He had converted part of his basement into what he called his hidey hole, a secret space where he kept souvenirs from his victims, photographs of his crime scenes, and detailed plans for future murders. The basement also served another disturbing purpose. Rader used it to act out violent fantasies when the urge to kill became overwhelming. He would bind and torture mannequins, practicing techniques he wanted to use on real victims. Sometimes he would dress in women's clothes and bind himself, photographing the entire process as a form of sexual gratification. His family never suspected anything. To them, Dad was just working on projects in the basement, maybe building something for the house or organising his tools. The idea that he was actually rehearsing murder scenarios was beyond their imagination. In 1991, Dennis Rader took a job that seemed tailor-made for his controlling personality. Compliance officer for Park City, a suburb of Wichita. His official role was to enforce city ordinances, measuring grass height, checking for unleashed dogs, investigating noise complaints. Rader threw himself more into the work with an obsessive enthusiasm that made him notorious throughout the community. He would patrol neighbourhoods with almost military precision, measuring lawns with a ruler, photographing minor violations, and writing detailed reports about infractions that most people would just consider trivial. Residents began to dread seeing Rader's city vehicle pull up outside their homes. He was known for his rigid interpretation of every rule, his refusal to show flexibility or common sense, and his obvious enjoyment of the power his position gave him over others. What they didn't realise was that this job served a much darker purpose. As a compliance officer, Rader had legitimate reasons to walk through neighbourhoods, peer into backyards, and observe people's daily routines. He could knock on doors and expect to be let in. He could take photographs and make detailed notes without arousing suspicion. The job was perfect reconnaissance for someone planning crimes. And indeed, several of BTK's later victims lived in areas where Rader had been conducting compliance checks in the weeks before their murders. After a long period of apparent inactivity, what experts call a cooling off period, BTK suddenly returned in 1985. Maureen Hedge was strangled in her home, her body later found dumped in a church, another twisted piece of symbolism from Radar's disturbed psyche. Then came Dolores Davis in 1991 and Vicky Wegley in 1986, though this murder wasn't initially attributed to BTK and was only confirmed later through DNA evidence. Each murder showed the same meticulous planning and ritualistic elements that had characterized BTK's earlier crimes. But now there was an added layer of sophistication. Rader had spent years perfecting his techniques, learning from his mistakes and developing more efficient methods of killing. What's particularly chilling is that during this period, Rader was at the height of his respectable public life. He was actively serving as church president, raising his teenage children and building his reputation as a dedicated public servant. To anyone watching, Dennis Rader appeared to be living the American dream. After Dolores Davis' murder in 1991, BTK seemed to disappear entirely. For over a decade, there were no murders, no communications, no sign that the killer even still existed. Many investigators wondered if BTK had died, moved away, or just simply stopped killing. But in 2004, something triggered him to resume communication. The 30th anniversary of his murders were approaching, and several news outlets were running retrospective stories about the BTK case. Rader couldn't resist the attention. He sent a letter to Wichita Eagle newspaper providing details about the Vicky Wegeler murder that proved he was responsible. Then came more letters, more packages containing photographs and personal items from victims. BTK was back and he wanted everyone to know it. The communications revealed a killer who was previously proud of his work and frustrated by what he saw as a lack of recognition. He seemed desperate to reclaim the spotlight, to remind Wichita that he was still out there, still in control. But there was something different about these new communications. BTK seemed older, more careless, perhaps overconfident from decades of avoiding capture. And that overconfidence would prove to be his downfall. In February 2005, BTK asked a question to the police that would change everything. Could they trace him if he sent communications via floppy disk? The police, displaying remarkable restraint, lied. They told him for a newspaper ad that floppy disk could not be traced. BTK believed them. On February the 16th, 2005, a floppy disk was found at Wichita Park. It had been left there by BTK in response to police assurances that it couldn't be traced back to him. But those assurances were a lie. One of the most successful deceptions in criminal investigation history. When forensic analysts examined the disk, they found deleted files that contained crucial metadata. The disk had been used at Christ Lutheran Church, and the deleted documents showed it had been accessed by someone named Dennis. After 31 years, BTK had finally made the mistake that would lead to his capture. Police quickly identified Dennis Rader as the person of interest. His daughter was in college, so they obtained a DNA sample from a pap smear she had done at a student health centre. The DNA was a familiar match to evidence from BTK crime scenes. On February the 25th, 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested outside his home in Park City. The man who had terrorised Wichita for over 3 decades was finally in custody. What happened next was perhaps the most chilling part of the entire case. When confronted with the evidence against him, Dennis Rader didn't deny his crimes or express remorse. Instead, he seemed almost relieved that he could finally talk about his projects. During his confession, Rader displayed a disturbing detachment from the horror of his crimes. He described murders with the same methodical precision he brought to his compliance officer duties. using clinical language to discuss acts of unimaginable brutality. He seemed proud of his ability to maintain his double life for so long, viewing it as an accomplishment rather than a deception. He talked about his victims as if they were objects rather than human beings, referring to his crimes as projects and describing his killing methods with technical precision. Perhaps the most disturbing of all was his apparent belief that people would be impressed by his ability to avoid capture for so long. He seemed to expect admiration for his organisational skills and attention to detail, completely unable to comprehend the moral horror of what he's just done. The revelation that Dennis Rader was BTK has sent shockwaves through Wichita that are still felt today. People who had known him for decades struggled to reconcile the mild-mannered church leader with the monster they had feared for so long. Members of Christ Lutheran Church were particularly devastated. This was a man they had trusted with their spiritual welfare, someone who had stood in that pulpit and spoken about God's love. The betrayal was beyond comprehension. His family were equally shattered. Paula Rader immediately filed for divorce, and both his children changed their names to escape the stigma. They had lived with a serial killer for decades without even knowing it, and the psychological trauma of that realization has lasted a lifetime. The BTK case has become a landmark study in criminal psychology, providing unprecedented insight into how serial killers can maintain normal lives while committing horrifying crimes. Dennis Rader's ability to compartmentalize his life so completely challenges many assumptions about criminal behavior. He wasn't a loner or a social outcast. He was deeply integrated into his community. He didn't struggle with employment or relationships. He maintained stable jobs and a long marriage. The case also highlights the terrifying possibility that other serial killers might be hiding in plain sight, using positions of trust and respectability as cover for their crimes. Dennis Rader is serving 10 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He would die in prison, and the world will be a safer place for it. But the BTK case, it leaves with uncomfortable questions that have no easy answers. How many Dennis Radars are out there? How many seemingly respectable community leaders, church officials and family men are harbouring a dark secret? The most chilling aspect of this case isn't just what Dennis Rader did, it's how successfully he hid what he was. For 31 years, he proved the most dangerous predators aren't always the obvious suspect. Sometimes, the monster really is the man next door. So that's today's story, and I have to say, it's one that will stick with me for quite some time. Now, if you've got something out of today's tale and you haven't already, please show that like button some appreciation. Also, please subscribe to the channel and turn those notifications on so you don't miss any of my daily uploads. Thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you in the next one.